Good evening to the Education Finance Committee meeting of Wednesday, March 31st for the Durham District School Board. I'd like to call this meeting to order. Recognize that we have a couple of trustees who are attending another meeting and will arrive late, Trustee Michael Barrett and Trustee Patrice Barnes. I would like to read the land acknowledgement. The Durham District School Board acknowledges that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships, both historic and modern, with the territories upon which our school board and school boards are located today. This area is home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. We acknowledge that the Durham region forms a part of the traditional and treaty territory of the Mississaugas, the Scugog Island First Nations, Mississauga peoples, and the treaty territory of the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nations. It is on these ancestral and treaty lands that we teach, learn, and live. Do we have any declarations of conflict of interest? Hearing none, could we move on to the approval of the agenda? The agenda was sent out. Can I have a Trustee Morton? Anybody opposed to the agenda? Hearing none, the agenda is approved as circulated. And we'll move on to the approval of the July 8th, quite a long time ago, but the July 8th, 2020 Education Finance Committee public meeting minutes. They were sent. Is there any errors or omissions? Hearing none, can I have somebody that was in attendance at that meeting to approve the minutes?
I'll put that motion
forward. All in favor? So, sorry, I should say, have any opposed? And hearing none. Okay, that has carried. Okay, we're going to move on very quickly to deputizations. We have a presentation from the Special Education Advisory Committee. Tara Cully is going to present, and then we have some written submissions. So we'll start off with Tara to present their submission.
Thanks, Donna. Let me share screen. Let me do that first before we start up. Let me know when you can see. Everyone.
Yep.
All right. Good. All right. Hi, everybody. Some of you may know me. My name is Tara Cully, and I am here on behalf of SEAC, our Special Education Advisory Committee, and I am the member representing the Durham Down Syndrome Association on our committee. So I'm here to provide the board and the finance committee with feedback and input on from SEAC in regards to the upcoming budget. Okay. So a few questions circulating around. As we know, this year is again a little bit odd in terms of timing. Normally we get numbers from the Ministry of Education on our GSNs, and then we have draft budgets. And by the time we actually get to public deputations, we actually have some data and some actual numbers that we can assess and look at. So however, with the change in the formula in the schedule, what we're doing is we're going to take the opportunity to provide some input and for food for thought, shall we say, for the trustees and for the finance committee to take into consideration. Just as a reminder, guiding principle for us, really sort of our mantra, is really the special education. It's not a dispensable luxury. It's really truly important. It's that ramp that provides access to the statutory commitment for education to all children. So we have an obligation to ensure that our most vulnerable students receive the necessary services and supports to give them that chance to succeed. So what I'll do is I'll go through some of the concerns that we have from last year. Given the world situation, a lot of the concerns that we had and expressed last year are the same. However, we'd like to include some emerging information and some more trends that we're sort of seeing that we'd like to make sure that have some visibility for the committee. So again, given where we are, physical and safety and mental health impacts. Most of you know, many of our students are more vulnerable, either medically fragile and statistically are more susceptible to mental health issues. So we do have to take utmost precautions to ensure their safety and well-being. We understand that the emergency funding that was in last year's budgets is not carrying over to this year's budgets. However, with all the variants coming around with COVID and the potential third wave and all of the day-to-day stressors that we all have, we still believe that we're going to need all of those health and safety protocols in place, as well as all of the resources and the funding to support that, to keep our students and our staff safe. Prolonged isolation, constantly changing protocols takes a toll on the entire family, increasing stress and affecting everyone's mental health. So the caregivers, as well as our students, are all being affected. And not to underplay it, but staff have families too. Board members have families too. Admin have families too. So we're all in this together. And so it's all really important that we all take care of each other. Remote learning for students. Continued impacts to our students and our caregivers, which is increasing our disparity in learning and achievement. So some classes are just less suitable for at-home learning. One example is the practical learning program in the secondary school system, where it's a lot of life skills and a lot of different other types of outcomes for those classes, and a lot of it's hands-on learning. So how do you properly provide a fulsome class with some of those types of things when you're doing it all virtually? Accessibility concerns for all of our students for those online programs, and how are we going to support our students at home? Students that have attention deficit issues that need to be constantly prompted to keep on task, that would then in a lot of cases fall to the caregivers and the parents at home, versus if they had someone physically sitting there the whole time in class with their EAs and the supports and the other teachers and the other students. How is that going to work? As well as with the potential for lockdown, everyone goes to virtual. There's a large number of increasing transition support is needed for our students switching between that home and the in-person learning. So either at these standardized times, or if we go into the proposed next lockdown. So how do we handle and make sure that our students are transitioning and are coping with the change in routines? As well, we also understand that there is an anticipated influx of new students into the system, which is further stressing our already stressed system. We have an increasing number of students coming from other regions, and a lot of those students, we understand, are already in specialized class programming. How are we going to accommodate with the given resources and the given staff, class sizes and class placements that we have? As well as there's a need for capacity building for that practical learning program for our educators who will be new to the program as it expands in the DDSB. So we need to make sure that that is in place. As well as there's other partner agencies that are expanding their operations within the Durham region, and that requires staff support for our in-residence program. I believe Stewart Homes is the one example of that. As well, we still have a lot unknown that's going on with the Ontario Autism program, and really what that truly means for our students with autism, and that impact on the students, the families, and the support that they're going to be getting. As well as we want to make sure that we manage our wait lists for all of our other additional services, for speech and language, for physical therapy, occupational therapy, all with and any other services we have with Grandview. We have to make sure we're managing our wait lists properly, and then the children can actually access support when the students are learning at home. What does that support, and what does those programming supports look like? So those are really our main concerns. So from a recommendation standpoint, we'd like to continue the board to continue our longstanding support for our students at those levels that we're required to provide those necessary supports to let them reach their potential. We truly recognize that the board has made a very large commitment, and we're very proud of the fact that we do believe that the board believes that our students can succeed, and we are placing those services in place and doing what we can to make sure that they can achieve their potential. However, we'd also like to make sure that as this plays out throughout the rest of the process, that we are able to continue the partnership and provide opportunities for input and for our planning. So going forward, we will make sure that we continue to lobby the ministry, make sure that we can keep using and lobbying the ministry to check the funding models, make sure that we have appropriate resources for the children that we need, as well as talking about what do we do with this current situation with the pandemic. We do need to make sure that our physical and mental health is of utmost importance, and that we have resources available to make sure that that stays. Our commitment is we do, and we will advise and continue to make recommendations for any oversight that we have on programming and services for our exceptional students. We will make sure that our member associations do continue to work with their provincial organizations to continue to lobby the government for positive change. And we will always advocate on behalf of all of our exceptional students and make sure that we provide as appropriate feedback for all parties concerned regarding policies and funding as we can. So again, thank you. We'd like to thank you for your efforts so that we can find new and innovative approaches, knowing the challenges that we have with the budgets and making sure that we do keep our students with special needs in mind as we're going through that budget. But it's crucial that we continue to collaborate and we have one voice and we continue forward. And that is it. Thank you. Any questions?
Yeah, thank you, Tara. I was going to say, any questions from trustees?
Stop sharing that.
Linda?
Thank you. Not a question as much as a comment, Tara. I just was writing something down as you were speaking. Your voice from SEAC is extremely valuable. And SEAC members are the hands-on frontline parents and workers, and your recommendations are respected and needed for the board to make good decisions for our most vulnerable students. So I thank you for coming and making your presentation today.
Thank you for giving us the time and the opportunity. Appreciate it.
Donna, you're muted.
I was going to say, I thought it was Nikki raising her hand, but it was her cat walking across the screen. Sorry. Okay, seeing no other questions. Thank you, Tara. Again, Linda stated it very well. You know, SEAC's opinion is very important, and your input is very important through this budget process. And thank you for taking the time to speak to us today. Okay. We are now going to move on to the written submissions. I'm going to ask Associate Director David Wright to present the written submissions that we have received.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Good evening, everyone. The two written submissions we received wouldn't be considered traditional budget deputations or delegations. More questions associated or tied to the budget process. We did feel it was important to address them this evening because the public did take the time to send them in. Not necessarily aligned exactly with where we are in the budget process right now, which makes the answers difficult. But through you, Madam Chair, I will read the first question. We have asked superintendents to draft short responses. So the first question is, what initiatives has the Durham District School Board budgeted for to combat systemic racism in school? And again, understanding that we're very early in the budget process, we're not quite there yet, but we did ask Superintendent Hamid to prepare a draft answer to that question. So through you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, and through you, Madam Chair. The Durham District School Board continues to hold Indigenous inherent rights and human rights as key foundational rights to the success of all of our students. We will request and allocate budget to fully support the implementation of our Indigenous education policy, human rights policy, and components of our equity strategic plan, including such components as the Compendium of Action for Black Student Success, the Guide to Accommodating Creed in Schools, and supports for our 2S LGBTQ+ students. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Superintendent Hamid. Next question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The second one I'm going to paraphrase because it is longer, but it is a request for funding for continual virtual options for elementary and secondary students for the 21-22 school year due to varying comfort levels and uncertainty around in-person learning. I thought it might be appropriate for Superintendent Davis to highlight to us where we are in the process right now, planning for next year.
Okay, thank you, and through you, Madam Chair. And I wanted to thank the parent for their question, and I'm happy to respond. So parent and community thinking and feedback is very important to us because we work with parents and guardians as partners in education. We have been soliciting feedback from our DDSB at home community since the beginning of the school year. We have already sent out 3 thought exchanges, one in September, one in December, and we just recently sent one out in March, and the survey will be closed on April 9th. We would like to continue to use the feedback we receive to plan forward. So we're asking parents and families to include their thinking in the survey. So far we've been focused our energy on working with the school community in order to plan for student success. We are just beginning to plan forward and are looking at options for next year. So we'd like to thank the community for their patience while we look at the possibilities and analyze the result of the current thought exchange to use that information. Then we will then prepare for further input, to gather further input from the community through surveys to determine next steps regarding our virtual learning. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't believe there's any further questions. Any questions from the trustees as a result of those submitted questions or comments? Okay, I see none, but I do have one question that sort of, because it is finance related, is that at this point in time, has there been any indication from the Ministry of Education on how the ongoing online is going to be funded? I know the answer, but I would like, just so that the public have an understanding of the process and that the Ministry of Education plays a key role in the provision of the funds for and how they're allocated.
So through you, Madam Chair, the short answer would be no. The Ministry of Education has not yet indicated plans for virtual learning for next year. However, I'm not sure if Director Marsh wanted to expand on that a little bit. Through you, Chair.
Thank you. Happy just to build on that a little bit, Chair Edwards. The Ministry of Education has indicated that there wouldn't be any specialized funding anticipated for virtual learning at this time. Certainly, I know directors of education have indicated there is an expense associated with virtual learning. And so if virtual learning will proceed, we would hope that the Ministry of Education would recognize those additional expenses. But at this time, they have said there would be no additional funding for it.
Thank you, Director Marsh. I see now that Trustee Morton has her hand up. So Trustee Morton.
Thank you, and through you, Chair. I'm really curious to know if the province is talking about additional supports for mental health, because our needs for mental health, we realize that they are huge this year. They will be ongoing next year. Is the province prepared to provide extra supports for mental health of students and staff? Thank you.
Either Director Marsh or Associate Director Wright. I'll pass it on to either of you.
The only thing I would start out with before passing it over to Director Marsh is that the ministry has made no funding announcement at all about next year as of yet, but has been fairly supportive of providing funding for the mental health needs of our sector this year, whether through flow-through funds from the federal government or provincial funds. But happy through you, Chair, to pass it over to Director Marsh. Thank you.
Through you, Chair, we are at a bit of a disadvantage. Normally when we hold this meetings, we've already received the detailed information in terms of the education budget. So Associate Director Wright is correct in terms of a lot of specifics, but I do know that Superintendent Macaulay can expand a little bit on some of the thinking that is occurring, and in particular around summer programming too, potentially.
Thank you so much. And through you, Chair. We have just been in receipt on Thursday of our summer learning transfer payment agreement. And in that we see the ministry commit to both closing of achievement gaps. So we'll be working between curriculum and inclusive student services and equity to build summer learning programs in that regard that will have special education supports as well as continuity of mental health supports. In those documents, the ministry has flagged direct service for students for continuity of care of mental health. We're looking at some co-work with the Catholic Board in terms of the potential of some groups over the summer, as well as educator preparedness and learning with the links to School Mental Health Ontario. And that does a lean in that the transfer payment also covers some transition supports, both for students with special education needs as well as mental health. And then as Tara so eloquently spoke to, we know that for many of our students, those two pieces come together into their learning experience in our schools. So we do see just a tip into next year through that summer TPA and look forward to further information from the ministry.
And I'll just build just to set some perspective in terms of the importance of this question. We've been tracking referrals in terms of mental health, and we know we're up about approximately 40% higher in terms of the number of referrals to staff for mental health. We also know through hospitals and whatnot that the significance of the mental health that is presenting in children and youth right now is of far much more serious in terms of the continuum of mental health. So we have indicated in conversations with the Deputy Minister that there are two pandemics underway currently. One is COVID-19 and one is the mental health one, and that the mental health one will be long lasting even once we get COVID-19 under control, and have indicated that we see this as a dire need and hope that there will be additional support for it.
Thank you, Dr. Marsh.
I just want to say thank you. I appreciate having that information, and I very much appreciate the fact that everyone understands the need that we have. Thank you.
Superintendent Macaulay, did you want to address, say a little bit more?
Thank you. So just on that note, trustees will be receiving information in your April board package that will be out to you shortly. We are bringing an information report on an update of on our mental health and well-being strategies, both across tier 1, 2, and 3, coming from our 3 mental health leaders. And in that, as Director March mentioned, we do quote some service statistics. And then just for trustees' background, as you read that report, what we did was take a consent snapshot when the report was written. So the service numbers reflected in the report are active on the day of report because we have people moving through plans of care and closing consents and then reopening. So that number represents students actively being supported on any day in our system. And that was a March date snapshot at that point. We are working on data full scope year as well, but we wanted to present you with information in real time of what was going on in our schools on a daily basis in terms of those consents and referrals. That's direct service statistics. Outside of that, there's the consultations and other service functions such as trauma, crisis, and loss. We've reported on the one-to-one clinical relationships and open consents to give you that information.
Thank you, Superintendent Macaulay. Looking forward to that report. Trustee Lindquist.
Thank you, Chair Edwards. So I'm glad to hear that we are going to keep pushing for funding for mental health supports, because that's the thing that I've been most concerned about with respect to the government's announcement that they're pulling back the funding, that the additional funding that they provided this year, because that's not going to disappear. So I think we're going to have to come up with a really significant strategy, probably across school boards with the help of UPSPA and other organizations, because we're in deep trouble on this, clearly. But I don't want to discount that, because it's very important, and I'm confident that that's happening. So I'm going to move on, or backwards maybe, not on, to a comment that was made earlier. And I just wanted to follow up on, because I think there's some misinformation out sort of floating in the world out there. And I want to be clear that either I'm not wrong, or, well, if I am, that's okay too. So we're talking about running virtual school with no extra funding, which is obviously going to have an impact on brick and mortar schools. But nobody's actually talking about what that impact might be on the brick and mortar schools if we don't have additional funding to run the virtual schools. And I'm wondering if, I know it's early days, so we may not have a sense of the number of students that are going to be enrolled in virtual schools, but I'm just trying to understand what that impact is going to be in both of those environments if we don't get additional funding.
Thank you, Trustee. There's Director Marsh. Do you want to approach that question?
I will. Thank you very much. So I think that's one of the reasons why we have delayed in terms of any engagement in elementary. I think we all recognize that the return to school in September is not going to be a regular return. And so we remain optimistic, although the provincial government at this time has not committed additional funds, that it will become apparent that additional funding is required to continue to be proactive and responsive to COVID-19 and the evolution of our working our way through this pandemic. At secondary, because timetabling needs to get going, we did do the course selection, and we followed the regular timelines in terms of course selection. And as part of the course selection, we indicated to families that they could opt into a virtual, and it was the plan was through the community school, and we would try to have virtual offerings very similar, embedded like we do in school staffing, like e-learning, so that there would be a sharing of staff between the community school and potentially virtual learning. The response to that was not high enough for us to actually go through with that model of virtual learning being part of the community school. So we will be communicating with all secondary families again to make sure that they understand that we're actually going to look to return to a centralized model for e-learning next year. And so what we would then be looking at is potentially, depending on the subscription to that centralized model, some families may decide that they actually want to be part of the community school and not switch to the centralized model. For those that do, we will then look at potentially a pairing with one of our smaller secondary schools so that we start doing some sharing of costs around administrator costs, and then potentially look at the sectioning and how enrollment will impact some of our schools depending on how many students end up in each. So one of the reasons why we are moving ahead at secondary is because the timetabling is more complex from the point of view of the sectioning. And so we wanted to be able to go into the budget process having some pretty secure data in terms of that. And we do think we should move ahead at this point. We've delayed long enough in terms of staffing. We're very behind already in terms of our staffing process. And so at elementary, we believe we should be going out and finding out how many families would be choosing virtual again. And that way we can weigh the cost of it and potential problem solving around it as part of the budget process as we move forward towards the summer. So I'm happy for any follow-up questions. I'm not sure if that addressed it specifically enough for Trustee Lundquist.
I think I will wait for future meetings to follow up, because I think that there's probably information that I need to actually ask more appropriate questions, but I appreciate the response. Thank you.
Okay. Seeing no other questions, can we move on to the next item? Associate Director Wright.
Thank you, Madam Chair. When we started setting the agenda for this meeting through you, working with our senior finance managers, we anticipated this preliminary budget analysis to bring all sorts of value and insight to the committee and the meeting this evening. Unfortunately, our optimism was not rewarded, and we have received very little information thus far on what we can expect next year in terms of funding. We do have a bit of information to share, though. At first glance, the education sector seemed to be glaringly absent from the recent provincial budget announcement, but after you spent some time and dove in, there were a few highlights. The announcement indicated a projected year-over-year decrease in provincial enrollment, down about 20,000 pupils. And the budget document in fine print stated that 20,000 pupils equated approximately to 1% funding, or $170 million. The year-over-year spend on the education sector is to be up about 2.6% year-over-year. So that, coupled with a decrease in enrollment, may mean an increase in per pupil funding in the range of 3.5%. It is likely the centrally bargained collective agreements, including increases to associated salary and benefits, are major contributors to the increase. But it's really tough to glean what else may be hiding in those large figures without the details having been announced. The provincial budget has highlighted that there will be additional one-time COVID supports funding, but to nowhere near the extent that they were this year. The budget release highlighted almost $1.6 billion in one-time COVID support funding will have been provided over the 2021 school year, with about $60 million earmarked for next year. So really a significant drop. Big picture, not bad in that the early indication is we don't expect to see any significant reductions in GSN funding next year, but certainly lots of questions hanging out there. We really won't have the details until the Grants for Students' Needs package is received, along with the PPF grants and the associated technical paper. Indications it may come as early as the week of April 19th, but certainly remains to be seen. So in terms of enrollment, the province is assuming a 20,000 per pupil reduction year over year. 2021 was a tough year on a number of school boards in terms of enrollment decreases relative to what they had projected. That was a big driver for the ministry to come forward with stabilization funding to the sector, which the first time certainly that I'm aware of that the ministry intended to keep school boards funding in line with what they had estimated in the summer. So that would have been based on estimated enrollment and staffing and operating expenses, as compared to what boards saw and submitted to the ministry with their revised estimate submission and actual enrollment and updated expenses in December. Durham District School Board did fairly well this year in terms of seeing higher enrollment than projected, which certainly worked in our favor. I'm sure some of the enrollment increase follows our trend, but there may have been families exiting larger centers into smaller Durham communities. However, it's important to highlight that superintendents, school administrators, and staff have worked diligently to ease the concerns of families and ensure students were accommodated as well as possible, both in person and virtually through DDSB at home, including reaching out to families who had initially decided homeschooling was a preferred method of curriculum delivery. So we had good success with our enrollment this year, but really largely due to the hard work of our staff. Student registrations for next year have been slow to come in, whether it's a factor of us not being able to get the message out in the same way we traditionally have, or if it's a reluctance on the part of parents because of the unknown. Enrollment in the elementary panel in particular continues to look flat as a best case scenario, but there is a small potential we won't meet our initial enrollment projections. So we're following school registrations closely, asking schools to provide updated enrollment figures at certain intervals over the next few weeks so that we can better understand how it may impact our budget process. Certainly there are significant cost drivers we don't have a handle on yet. Without getting into details of what everyone around the table is so intimately familiar with, DDSB did invest significant resources to support this 2021 school year, lowering class size, cohorting secondary schools, reducing the number of riders on buses, supporting well-resourced virtual schools, ensuring increased custodial supports, etc. These are all things that aren't sustainable in the long term if they aren't funded. And so certainly we're hoping that there will be some recognition of that in the coming GSN announcement. It is difficult to move through a process like the budget process without these types of significant unknowns hanging out there. Even if we receive the GSN at the end of April, the ministry has highlighted that they will likely not be in a position to provide direction on some key pieces, including requirements to provide different learning options next year. They've highlighted May at the earliest for some of that information to come out. So all of that being said, we'll move forward the best we can in spite of the uncertainty and unknown. At the February 16th board meeting, we presented a set of guiding principles that would guide our internal budget discussions and decisions. And so that's what we're going on. The focus of our decisions will be student-centered. We will align our financial resources to meet system and operational goals and priorities that have been highlighted in the strategic plan. We will invest in the future of our organization by focusing on leadership, equity, engagement, and innovation that supports student success and well-being. Our budget decisions will support student, staff equity, and human rights. And engaging in a collaborative budget process, like you saw this evening with our deputations, will assist in setting priorities. Lastly, we'll ensure that budget decisions we make and propose ensure strong fiscal responsibility into the future. So that is the preliminary analysis. Madam Chair, if you have any questions at all, happy to answer them through you.
Any questions from trustees at this point? Trustee Stone?
Hi, thank you. Just out of curiosity, the 20,000 decrease in Ontario, I'm not sure if that's a normal number over that has been over the years, or do we know if it is because more families have chosen to place their children in private schools or have decided to do homeschooling?
Yeah, great question. Unfortunately, it's one line in the budget document that's sort of in the assumptions section. I will say that the provincial enrollment figure was trending upwards over the last couple of years. There was a significant period of decline, but has been trending upwards. So whether it's due to slowed immigration, I can't speculate. There was nothing to indicate that.
Any other questions? Seeing none, we can move on to the supplemental budget report. I'm not sure if that's Jennifer or yourself, Associate Director. Right.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm actually happy to introduce both of our senior finance managers, Jennifer Machen and Melissa Durward, who are going to walk you through the supplemental budget report information this evening. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, and through you, Chair. On page 4 of the package is the report this evening. I'll walk you through section 2.1, potential liabilities. The first item identified is the education development charge deficit. Most of the information contained here in the report is not new information. It can be found in the 2020-21 budget book. However, I will draw your attention to the final paragraph, which is the more updated information. As we approach the halfway mark of the 5-year bylaw, we are beginning to see a trend in that the number of permits being issued on which the EDCs can be collected is falling significantly below the assumptions made in the background study, which drove the bylaw. As a result, that is further exacerbating the revenue shortfall and increasing the deficit that we're seeing. Naturally associated with the decrease in permits, there would be a slowing or a decrease in the net growth. However, most of the school sites that we purchase have an option agreement on them, which give us a specified time period in which we have to purchase the site. So there may be some cases where the growth is slow coming, but due to the expiry of the option, we're still in a position where we need to purchase the site, even though the funds are not coming in. So further time delay there and an increase in the deficit. Staff do continue to work with consultants and our co-terminus board to find a solution and lobby with the ministry to try and find a solution for this issue. The next item in the report is the asset retirement obligation. This was first brought forward to trustees in a January 2020 board report. It's an accounting standard that's been issued by the Public Sector Accounting Board, and it's related to accounting for liabilities that will exist upon the eventual retirement of an asset, so a building, a site, that sort of thing. No real updates at this point. Staff have compiled the information we believe will be necessary to complete the implementation of the standard. However, we continue to wait for the ministry to provide guidelines and advice as to how to implement. The timeline has been pushed out. It was originally meant to be effective for fiscal years beginning on or after April 1st of 2021. And in June of last year, the extension was made, and it will now be effective for the 2022-23 school year. So we continue to wait for the ministry to advise on implementation. The third item in the report is the Uxbridge Secondary School oil remediation. This is something that's been around for a number of years. I'm sure trustees are aware. No significant update at this point, just that staff continue to meet with the township, OSB, legal counsel, and an environmental consultant to determine the potential timeline for the remediation work to happen that the board will be responsible for funding. And I will pass on to Jennifer for section 2.2.
Thank you, Melissa, and through you, Madam Chair. Section 2.2 outlines projected accumulated surplus. So you'll notice that these numbers are updated projections from the original budget last spring. So particularly the first line, the working fund reserve, you'll notice that the deficit of 1.17 million is significantly less than the 8.3 million that was approved at the time of the budget. This is as a result of a stabilization grant that we received from the ministry. The other significant reserve amounts are for retirement gratuity and WSIB, and we are fully funded for the actual actuarial liability of these amounts. We have a few other smaller reserve amounts for specific purposes, such as special education and transportation, and the details of these reserves are all outlined in the report. And Melissa and I are happy to answer any questions that you might have at this time.
Questions from trustees? Okay, I have trustee Barrett and then trustee Stone.
Thank you, Trustee Edwards. I've got a couple of questions on a couple of items, if I could. First of all, the first question I had was with regards to the EDC charges, one of my favorite topics of conversation. Understand that we project at the end of this 5-year cycle, we'll have about a $270 million deficit. And you are suggesting that we need $1 billion, $1.2 billion that we have to spend. So if I was going to do a calculation, and I know the math is not very good, that would mean that at the end of spending the $1.2 million, we would have a deficit of over $800 million in that account if indeed there's no further changes in the EDC rates. And probably under this government, they aren't going to change drastically, because there's no way that the government's going to increase it from 3449 to 11,008. So that means that we would have a deficit at that point, and I recognize we're still maybe 12 or 13 years away from that, but it would mean a potential deficit of $800 million. That deficit of $800 million that we have to finance and that we have to then start to pay the interest, and I understand that interest is now paid. So two questions. First of all, the interest that has to be added to the EDC deficit, does that come out of cash, or is it a non-cash item, a non-cash debt that sits there? Because what I'm trying to ask is, does it impact the cash that we have available for our classroom? That's my first question. So I'll just wait for that one, Donna. So,
Thank you. And through you, Chair. The interest is essentially a non-cash item as we do the short-time financing over the year. We finance enough to make the board's account whole, but it is obviously increasing the deficit every time. So we're borrowing more each time, and eventually we'll someday need to cover that off.
yeah, so it just keeps getting added to the Visa card balance. It just never gets paid off. Okay, so that 800 million, I'm not sure who would answer this one. Or let's say the 270, let's talk with real numbers. Where does that show up? Does that show up on total Ontario provincial debt? Or is that segregated so it never really shows up as a deficit on the Ontario books? It really just shows up on a debt for the board. So is this a way of being able to mask that debt? Or does it actually roll all up into the Ontario debt that my great grandchildren will be paying for? I'm not sure if anyone can answer that. So
sure, it should show up as a debt even when the province consolidates, because it does show as a debt on our books, and it's not a debt between ourselves and the ministry. So it should roll up and show as a debt for our board. For the boards that aren't actually externally financing, not so clear, but because we do externally finance and we actually have that debt recorded on our books.
yeah, we have it reported in our books. Does it roll up to show on the Ontario deficit then? Or is it segregated?
I would assume it would, because it is an external debt, not one between ourselves and the ministry.
Okay. I'll maybe ask that question of the minister one day to see if he could answer that one. So the other question I have is with regards to the Uxbridge Secondary School remediation. And I think it has a history as long as I've been around here, as well as it continues to ebb and flow, if you excuse the pun. Just want to clarify, Uxbridge is suggesting, or Brock Township, or Township of Uxbridge is suggesting it's a $5 million. You've used the board's future obligation of 700,000. Is that our share of the 5 million, or is that just kind of an interim obligation?
Through you, Madam Chair, I might tackle this one. I think we're seeing a change in position from the township, from our original understanding that everybody was happy to move forward until the road needed to be resurfaced or repaired, which time we would remediate, and certainly would be a lower cost because there would be cost sharing. It seems that the position may be changing, although we're entering into conversations with the township, but the position might be that we remediate before that road would be otherwise repaired. And so if we're responsible for tearing up the road, replacing the municipal services, remediating, and then making everything look nice, it might escalate to up to $5 million. So I think that's a fairly recent current.
Okay, so understanding that, and that could mean obviously a lot of resources out of our classrooms to be able to, and I understand we've run out of insurance. We ran out of insurance money a while back. And I think I know the answer, so I might be leading the witness a little bit, David, so I apologize for that. It's not like it'd be the first time, but have we ever approached the ministry to be able to look for additional funding in order to be able to try and help out with this element? And I think the answer is no, we haven't.
Through you, Madam Chair, I also think the answer is no, we haven't. Trying to think of a rationale to approach the ministry other than if it does escalate to something as significant as full remediation on our own with a price tag of $5 million. Legitimately, we might be suggesting to the ministry we're not sure where the funding's coming from for this. So stay tuned on that one. If there's an opportunity to bring it up, and it is of a significant as might be the high end of this estimate, and certainly we might approach them with that conversation.
Yeah, I'm just suggesting, and thanks for that. I didn't think we'd done anything, but not that not that I would have expected something just to do independently, but it may be something that we want to be able to consider, because 5 million, as you know, where do you get $5 million? Take it out of the retirement gratuity, take it out of the WSIB provision. I don't think so. So, okay, we'll just keep that in mind as we go forward. And that was my questions, Trustee Edwards.
Thank you, Trustee Barrett. Trustee Stone.
Thank you, Chair, and through you. Just for the EDCs, just looking at the number 1949 to 11,876. Is that an immediate jump that you're talking about, or over a certain amount of time?
Through you, Chair. So the 1949 was the EDC charge that was happening from the previous bylaw. And during the process of the current bylaw, through the background study, the rate calculated based on the land needs was 11,876 per permit. But unfortunately, due to ministry changes in the regulation, they've limited the rate that we're allowed to charge. They only permitted us an increase of $300 per year. So we were at 1949 for the first year of the bylaw. We were allowed to increase that by $300 to the 2,249, and then 3 years each, or $300 each subsequent year. But unfortunately, to actually recoup and cover off the anticipated land costs, what we should be charging per permit is 11,876.
Okay, thank you. And I also have a question regarding the permits. Why are the permits slowing down so much?
I don't know that I have the actual answer, but I'd be happy to take that back as well to facilities staff. Just a decrease in the building. So I'm not sure why they're not building as quickly as was anticipated originally. I'd be happy to take that back though to facilities staff for a more fulsome answer.
Okay, thank you. And I hate to ask this about the Uxbridge oil. It's too bad we couldn't make any money on the oil, but it reminds me of the Clampets, up come a bubbling crude. But I just need a little background, because I remember this, but I can't remember exactly where this oil is coming from and why there's so much oil that it's been going on for what it says decades. So could somebody just give me a little quick background on that? Thank you.
Through you, Madam Chair, I have somewhat limited knowledge, but I do understand that heating oil over time was spilled on the site, and that leached into the soil. Heating oil is a heavy oil and has a tendency to penetrate and spread. And so there's no continued or ongoing contamination of the soil. There's historic contamination that has been isolated by barriers erected, through the expertise of engineers over time to ensure no further spread or contamination. It's just removing that contaminated soil at some point in time and having it remediated off-site, replacing it with clean soil. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, but so in the meantime, it is leaching down into it and obviously going out onto the street, or has it for now?
So if you can picture a bladder in place, so it has been prevented from leaching any further based on advice of engineers, and so it's contained. It's just a question of when we can remediate the section that is contaminated.
Melissa, did you want to respond to that?
Sorry, I actually had a friend from facilities send me a quick message. They're watching the meeting. So the slow in the permits being issued is actually related to COVID. It's slowed it down.
Okay, thank you, Melissa. Trustee Barrett, did you have another question?
Just actually to add to this, because I've been around long enough. It certainly was a contamination of the heating oil from the school. When it was originally heated with oil, there was a significant leak that occurred over a long period of time. And the problem with heating oil, it is a heavier oil. and the parts per million are very low from the standards of contamination. And heating oil spreads like a river, and the flow of the water from the school site took it out towards the site. And I think we contaminated significant football fields of land. And you've got to remember the parts per million is very, very, very small for it to be acceptable. I believe in the past we have been able to have to buy houses and things of that nature for the contamination. So now they have put David's right, they put a bladder into place, and it will continue to be an issue until you actually dig out the soil and replace it. And unfortunately, the only reason I know that is because we deal with that, in other industries as well. Heating oil is the worst, Linda, from spreadability and contamination. So it's a very large area. So,
do we have any other questions from trustees? I'm just trying to make sure I look at the hands and also in the participant window. I'm seeing no other questions from trustees. Thank you, Melissa and Jennifer, for your report and answering questions. The next item actually is any other business, and I don't really see any other business. Our next finance meeting is May 5th. Hopefully we will have some information, especially GSNs, but again, it's all pursuant to the government's release of the GSNs and what type of information we will have and the meeting dates. But it does, I know that we've selected a bunch of meeting dates, and there's one that's to be determined, but the further we get along in this the process of not receiving GSNs, I'm sure we're going to end up needing that extra date. So that being said, our next meeting is May 5th, and I call for the meeting adjourned. Anyone who adjourn? Trustee Thatcher. Call the meeting adjourned. Thank you.